Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
First one is titled, She Had to Pay Up $35,000. About 8 years ago, my girlfriend's friend had just graduated from university. She had managed to land a very high-paying job in the private sector. She would constantly brag about how she was making so much money and how she had an expensive car. She would tell all her friends they need to get their butts in gear, so everyone could be like her. This girl was the definition of witch. Fast forward about 2 years, she has now landed a new, higher-paying job with the government. After being with them for about a year, she hurts her back and is on long-term disability for months, and there is no sign of her going back to work anytime soon. You would think that someone with an injured back would not do a lot of physical activity like skiing, partying at the bars, etc. She had a desk job, and everyone knew she was faking. The best part of all this? She was posting pictures and adding comments on Facebook about all the fun she was having. After months of observing this, I did some research and tracked down the name of the insurance company that handles government workers. I filed an anonymous complaint and thought nothing would happen. About a year later, I found out she had been sued by the government for over $35,000 in claimed wages while she was on disability. She tried to fight it in court, but the insurance company had hired a private investigator and tracked her every move. They had screen grabs of her Facebook statuses as well as photos taken by the investigator from his car of her doing recreational activities, proving her back was okay. She lost the fight and had to pay the $35,000. She lost her job, went bankrupt, and had to move back in with her parents. She is currently a 36-year-old unemployed single woman living in an isolated rural area with her parents. Next one is titled, Want to Live Like It's a Constant Party at Your House? My mum doesn't think so. Let me set the scene. The year is 2017 and my family and I live in a quiet suburban street. It's mostly retired couples and some families with very young kids. Normal. Now earlier this year the house diagonal from us decided to move and sold it. About the day after everything's packed away, 5 cars come peeling down the street, and pull into the driveway and out in the road. They're a bunch of college-age kids, so we give them some slack and let them go for a day or two. Meanwhile, day in and day out different cars keep peeling down the street, some are over 30 miles over the speed limit. This does not go over well with the neighbors, for most of the younger kids walk and ride their bikes down our street. Everyone's concerned they might hurt someone or someone's dog. Before something serious can happen, some of the neighbors who've lived here 20+ years go over and meet the newbies. This includes my mum. They're polite at first. They agreed to not go over 35, but more cars keep racing down the road. Along with that, they seem to be having parties every other Tuesday with about 30 cars up the street. Now the niceties are over, and the cops are called. Usually, they wouldn't do this, but about 5 calls came in from a bunch of houses and the police department was fed up. Having nothing better to do, they send one of the deputies and they wait around the corner for a few hours a day. About 2 fines are given, and then they slow down. Except they get smart, there's only one place the deputy can hide, so they send 1 car to see if they're there. If not, they speed again. The deputy gives up after about 3 days and is gone. A few months pass, and we were at a loss of what to do. Summer is almost here, so my brother and I are outside more. We have a basketball hoop at the edge of the road, right across from the house. Our driveway is at almost a 45 degrees angle, and all my brother's buddies come and play, so we leave it there. There's a problem, the cars keep parking to block the hoop. My brother's upset since that's all he used to do in the summer. He goes over to the house and guys just shut the door on him. Now my mum's upset. She marches over there and asks them to move their cars, sweetly, and when they refuse she hatches a plan. This summer was a hot one, and my mum decides to cook some homemade pea soup. Now she burns this batch, by accident, of course. Instead of chucking it out, she puts it in this big plastic jar, seals the lid, and places it out on the back porch in the middle of the sun. Weeks pass, and she occasionally opens it. There are maggots squirming around and it's turned a deep brown-green. There's also this clear yellow liquid that separated itself to the top. Disgusting. Meanwhile, my brother is determined to play basketball when there's a little opening. About 20 minutes in, the ball bounces onto one of the cars by accident. There was no mark, but the car alarm goes off, so he's trying to leave. I run out to see one of the regulars who lived there, a woman, yelling obscenities at my brother and how he needs to pay for her car. My mother runs out after me and starts yelling at the lady to get away from my brother. There was no damage, and it was clear, but the lady kept screaming. My brother and I run inside and watch as the woman follows my mum up the driveway, waving her arms and still yelling. My mum yells for her to get off her property or she'll call the cops. By now our older neighbors are watching, some walking over, and the lady realized that she better leave it or she might actually get in trouble. She runs across the street and slams the door. Around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday with one of their parties, my mum puts on a gas mask, my dad worked in pest control so he had one, and takes out the soup. The stench was terrible. It was rotting meat and something indescribable. She takes the jar and goes over to the cars as quietly as possible. Onto almost every car she dumps the rotting pea soup onto the windshield and into that space where there are the windshield wipers. Before anything, I have to explain these were nice cars. Not sports, but Priuses and new cars, which doesn't fit with their age. The next morning, my mum's out sitting in the garage, smoking a cigarette like always. It's around 6 a.m. and the lady that yelled at my brother comes out first. She's obviously tired as she gets into her car. A minute or two passes and this woman has the most disgusted looking face. She turns on the windshield wipers and a hunk of rotting ham is sent flying. My mum's now in tears, and I mean tears. I wake up and head downstairs to the garage to see the woman yelling and about 20-ish kids heading out to their cars. Each one's trashed. The cops are called, but since there's no evidence, they can't press charges against my mum. One by one they leave in their ruined cars. They moved out 3 weeks later. Last one is titled, "Nobody Has Time for a Helicopter Hoa President, Especially a Fake One." This happened when my wife and I first got married. My grandfather had passed just a couple months before and left me a very sizable inheritance with a note to make sure I use it smartly to start a good life for my wife and I. My father-in-law owns a real estate company that buys foreclosed houses and rehabs them, and he knew of a great starter home for my wife and I and agreed to pay to have it rehabbed with the understanding that we would pay him back when we were better established or after 2 years when we sold the house. So we bought the house and it took about 90 days to rehab it before we moved in. This is an important fact later on. So we finally moved into our house and had been there about 2 weeks when someone came and knocked on our door stating that they were the Homeowners Association (HOA) president and asked for my landlord's contact information. I explained that we didn't rent the home and that we were the owners, and then they followed that up by asking to speak with my parents. I reiterated again that I was the homeowner and asked them what they wanted. They explained that there was an HOA for the neighborhood and that I needed to sign the HOA rules and that I owed $90 pro-rated for my dues, but that they would give me 30 days to pay as a courtesy. However, they needed me to sign the rules right then. I told them I wanted to read and review them first before I agreed to sign anything, and they were extremely pushy about signing them right then. I refused and they told me that I had 7 days to sign them and explained that they have the legal power to fine me if I do not turn in a signed copy at that time. I called my in-laws because I didn't know anything about HOAs and asked them for their advice. My father-in-law got upset saying that it should have been disclosed prior to the sale, but sometimes with HUD houses that get missed. We agreed that the $30 per month fee wasn't horrible, especially because they did provide a really nice playground for the neighborhood. So I agreed and signed the rules. There were a couple that seemed a little over the top to me, but I agreed anyway because, from my understanding at the time, I really didn't have any choice. It seemed fine enough until about a month passed and we had a small housewarming party with a couple of friends. Literally, there were less than 8 people there including my wife and I. The house was small but it had a nice deck, so we were out back having a small fire using a fire pit one of our friends had just given us when I heard someone knocking at the door. No, pounding, like a freaking cop. I just went around the house and there was the HOA president, with his car in front of my house, with a yellow police light on top. Yes, I'm serious. I asked him how I could help him, and he very sternly told me that I was in violation of the HOA rules by throwing a party outside of approved hours, 10 p.m. curfew, and that I needed to send my friends home or quietly take it inside. I checked my watch and it was 10:05 p.m. I was amazed, but we took it inside regardless. The next day, the very next day, I had a letter from the HOA stating that it was my official warning for violation of the HOA rules by throwing a, and I quote, wild bonfire that was a safety hazard while drinking. I literally hadn't drunk at all. Whatever, I brush it off and figured it was a no big deal. Flash forward 6 to 9 months, we were hosting a teen group devotional for our church one afternoon and we were playing a game of football in the street. We lived on a connecting street that got virtually no traffic, and only had 2 houses on it, ours and the family across from us, whose kids were also playing in the game. All of a sudden I hear a police siren, and see the yellow light flashing. HOA president gets out and tells us that we have to break it up immediately as it's a safety hazard because one of the kids could run over. I was fed up with him and told him that they were fine and that we've been watching for cars and that he was literally the first car we've seen, and we had been playing for over an hour at that point. He insists and asks what would happen if an ambulance or police officer needed to come down that street to save someone's life. This was stupid because literally both streets we were connected to have entrances from the main road. I gave in and we went inside. The next day, I get a letter explaining that I was being fined $60, the maximum fine allowed for a first offense, and that if I wanted to protest it, I could attend the next HOA meeting. I decide that I want to protest the fine, but noticed that the fine was due in 30 days and the next HOA meeting wasn't for 35 days. I opted not to pay until after the hearing and wrote a letter back to the HOA president stating as such. I go to the meeting and it's literally myself, the HOA president, the HOA secretary, president's wife, vice president, president's neighbor, and treasurer, vice president's wife. My protest was immediately overruled, and I was also charged a $30 late fee for not paying on time, despite notifying him. I was fed up, I couldn't take it any longer, but realized I really didn't have any recourse. About 4 to 5 months later, we gave birth to our first child, and about a month after that I was driving home one night. I was working a second job in retail at the time, and my buddy in the military called me. He had been deployed when my daughter was born and was calling to congratulate me. When I got home, I didn't want to risk waking up my sleeping newborn daughter, so I just sat in my car with the engine running as it was a little chilly outside. I sat there for about half an hour when I heard the police siren, and saw the yellow lights. Now keep in mind, police sirens aren't quiet, and this was right in front of my house. His stupid yellow light was flashing everywhere, including into my daughter's bedroom. I got out of the car, and rather rudely told him to turn off the light as to not wake my daughter. He explained that I looked suspicious, sitting in my car with it running outside of my house. I explained the situation and he told me I had to go inside and that my history of being a troublemaker wouldn't grant me any leniency. I basically told him where I thought he could go and proceeded to sit on the hood of my car. He sat there for another 15 minutes telling me I needed to go in, and at one point touched my shoulder. I explained to him that if he touched me again I would take it as a sign of aggression and defend myself, which he responded by getting in his car and leaving. He circled the block about 4 times the next 30 minutes, which was when I got too cold to stay out and finally went inside. The next day, I get a hand-delivered letter from him and the vice president, and he also asks me to step outside to talk about last night's incident. He explains that he was being nice by not calling the police on me after I threatened him, at which point I cut him off and told him that he needed to get off my property before I called the police on him for trespassing. I read the letter and saw that he was giving me 2 different fines for $180 each, which was the maximum amounts. One for violating curfew, and one for disobeying the night watchman. I was done. I had reached my breaking point. This is where the revenge comes in. I start looking into HOA laws and regulations regarding fines and how to protest them because I felt like this was clearly abuse. I find that the law states that you must be notified of an HOA 10 days prior to closing on a house and must be served with the HOA rules within 45 days of purchase, or you are not subject to being forced to participate in the HOA. I remember that we weren't served until after we moved in, which was close to 90 days after we closed. So I called my real estate agent, who is a very close family friend. My in-laws have bought literally thousands of houses from her over the past 35 years, and asked if she had the paperwork still, and she said she can get me a copy. I looked and it was over 90 days after purchase that we were notified, and there was no disclosure statement at closing. Relator says she must have misplaced it because it's required by law to be provided prior to the sale, and basically that she wouldn't miss something like that because it comes to her when they do a title inspect on the house whether or not there is a registered HOA. She does a little digging and calls me back 2 days later and says that my neighborhood doesn't have an HOA registered with the city or county, which is required. I end up calling the county office in charge of registering and give them the neighborhood name, and she says that our neighborhood is registered in the other city and not in our city, and that if we wanted to start an HOA we would have to follow these certain steps, and that without those, the HOA wouldn't be allowed to collect any money or have any authority. Apparently what had happened was our neighborhood was originally all in one city, but when the city lines changed, the neighborhood was split in half. The other neighborhood kept the HOA that was registered, and our HOA president was supposed to register with the state but didn't feel like jumping through all of the hoops that it required. I was ready to walk down to the president's house and rip into him, but decided to be smart for a minute. I talked to my neighbor across the street, who also hated the HOA, and told him what I found out. He was furious about it as well. We talked to a few more and get a group of about 10 of us together that agree we need to show up at the next HOA meeting. Word had apparently spread because there ended up being more people than the library meeting room could host. I had specifically asked to be the speaker for the group, which they were nice enough to let me do. The president tried to prevent me from speaking due to being overdue on my fines. At this point, I'm about 3 weeks late on my last set of fines, with a $30 per week penalty on each fine, so my current bill is set to about $540, but I spoke anyway. I explained to them that I had contacted my in-law's attorney, also a family friend, who had drafted together a lawsuit regarding the fact they were impersonating a registered HOA in order to collect money from us, which was fraud. The president dismissed me and said I had no idea what I was talking about and that he had had enough of my antics. The staff members all left immediately while the rest of us stayed and talked. A month later we served them formally, myself and 20 other homeowners, suing them for all fines and HOA dues we had paid, to the tune of approximately $50,000, as some of these families had been there over 10 years. The president and vice president got their own attorney who attempted to legitimize the HOA, but it required the signature of like 90% of the homeowners. They got 3 signatures, including the 2 of themselves. Some other old bitter hag signed. After that failed, they tried to settle by agreeing to abolish the HOA and showed that they hadn't financially gained from it and that all funds had been used for the park upkeep, snow removal, and other neighborhood events. We took a vote and this was turned down in overwhelming fashion. I was surprised. I actually voted to accept this. Then about a week later one of the other families calls and mentions something about the park maintenance and snow removal. Apparently, he had given a quote to do the landscaping for the park, cutting the grass, mulching, etc., and his quote had been a couple of $100 cheaper than what they were paying, and that it had always bothered him because the person that did those jobs was the vice president's son, and that what they were paying him was pretty outrageous in terms of what's standard. Eventually, it went to court where the judge looked at everything and mandated that they pay $21,000, $1,000 per homeowner, plus attorney and court fees, which were like another $2,000 for a total of $23,000 in damages. Additionally, they were fined by the city's governing body after it was reported. I don't know how much the fine was though. We ended up selling the house that following summer, but I talked to a couple of friends that still lived there about a year after it, and they said that the president and vice president both sold their houses and moved away because they were pretty much hated by everyone in the neighborhood, and that they had an informal HOA that people donated to for upkeep of the park. Thanks for listening.